Welcome to SR Studios Inside the Issue. Today's guest is Latifa Ayad, whose story Oil is featured in the spring 2025 issue of Southern Indiana Review. Latifa Ayad is a Libyan-American writer who's born and raised in Sarasota, Florida. She earned her MFA in fiction at Florida State and is a PhD candidate in fiction at Western Michigan University. Ayad is a MacDowell Fellow, and her novel In Progress was a runner-up for the James Jones First Novel Fellowship. Her work has been published in Kenyon Review, Cincinnati Review, North American Review, Smokelong Quarterly, Wasafiri, and others. She is currently editor-in-chief of Third Coast Magazine. Latifa, welcome to Inside the Issue.
Hi, thanks for having me, Casey. I'm really excited to do this.
Great. I'm so glad to have you. So would you mind starting off by reading, since it's a flash piece, reading your story Oil for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is Oil. It is hard not to fall for a dictator in a world that's all about oil. His soft curls beneath his beret that he styles with a touch of oil. Extra virgin, first pressing. Oil can make America bomb you. Oil can make America stop bombing you. And the sand always burbling black at the dictator's command for your country that was once desperate in the wake of Mussolini's low-flying planes and starvation campaigns. Your country, like Hajar, running back and forth in the desert, searching for water between Safa and Marwa, desperate not to die of thirst. And the Zamzam well bubbled up because God does answer desperate pleas. The oil builds highways, public schools, miles of pipe so water can be pumped across the desert. The blood quells dissent and sows fear. You always like to be a little afraid of your lovers. Your dictator has a Steinway in his bedroom, and after lovemaking picks out tunes, sometimes a somnolent berceuse, sometimes the nostalgia of nocturnes. All art comes from outside your country, and this is one of the things that makes radicals of young men. The dictator's fingers are so delicate on the piano keys, so rough inside you, nails kept clipped and clean. He posts guards on a slice of beach so you can wear the string bikini he bought you on a trip abroad. With your eyes open in the stinging water, you see a pair of seahorses, tails twined together, holding tight as the waves toss them. The dictator lounges on the beach in a Speedo, his legs pale and perfectly shaped, carpeted in curling black hair. You build a fire, and the dictator admires your peasant background and the way you layer logs for heat. You boil a lobster over the coals, imported from Maine. You watch it dance and redden in the pot. The dictator cracks its claws and feeds you morsels of meat with his fingers. In the water, an ibis dips its sickled beak. After, you attend a hanging. There is still sand gritting between your toes. A professor and two students on trial. You are in prime seats behind the basketball net. The stadium is filled, has been filled. You are swallowed by black, have covered your hair, your face, your string bikini. Listening is like standing behind an army jeep when the engine catches. The confession of the crying professor, sputtering puffs of burnt diesel, clouding your lungs. The dictator beside you pumps a fist in the air when the rope pulls taut. His fingernails still sport a sheen. The lobster, not dipped in butter like they do in Maine, but in olive oil, mellow and still filmy in the back of your throat.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that final image is wonderful. So can you tell us, where did this story come from?
So this is an unusual one for me, because generally when I write something, it's kind of just like bursts forth. I'm like walking on a hike or something, and I get this image, and I'm like, I have to write this down right now, and that's how the story comes out. This came out from a writing prompt that we did. I was in a flash fiction forms class this semester with Thisbe Neeson, and we did an ink blot prompt on the first day. And so I've got the ink blot here. We made these ink blots. I know it's pretty wonderful. And my professor told us, like, just write down 20 images you see in this, which ended up being extremely difficult. I got like 7, and then I started really having to search, or I would look in the negative space of the image at like the white parts. And one of the images that came forth was a dictator in a beret. Um, and so after I had listed out these 20 images, she told us to write a flash piece that had all 20 in it.
Wow.
Which was impossible. I ignored that direction. But I did use probably about 10 of them in the original draft. And I had noticed as I was bringing these together that there were certain images that kept coming up a lot. So there were images associated with pollution. There were images associated with the sea. There were images associated with war, like the World War II bomber, the dictator, a raised fist, right? And so I I started with just that first sentence, and I think I never would have written this piece without this prompt. And it was kind of magical in that way, because I had been doing a lot of thinking about show trials, and about public hangings, and I had been working on a play kind of about this person in Gaddafi's inner circle called Huda the Hangwoman, who was like a very enthusiastic participant at public hangings. But I never would have thought to write from the perspective of somebody who was entangled with the dictator in this way. But the image of the beret for me is like kind of an attractive, sexy dictator look, if I'm being honest, which is, one of the things about dictators is their magnetic appeal. They
Mhm.
wouldn't have ended up in power if people weren't attracted to them to the begin with. So moving from that image, I started to imagine what it would be like to be a woman in a very, very close circle with the dictator who is part of this luxurious lifestyle, and is kind of complicit in these activities, but also probably endanger herself any moment that she's with him. So that's where the piece came from. Um, and I was really, really pleased with how that prompt went. I'm not usually a big believer in prompts. I think like, oh, we have to come from an organic place. The story has to come naturally to us. But that prompt did end up getting into a really organic space for me.
That's really cool that how that tends to work. But it's really interesting that out of a prompt, particularly one like this ink blot prompt, comes these details that have historical and cultural stuff going on. I mean, and the story is, I think, I'm speculating here. I think intentionally a little bit, uh, not vague's not the right word, but it's sort of intentionally avoiding specifying which country and which dictator, which I think
Right.
works completely in its favor. But yet it still is drawing all of these things. So I guess in a weird way, the stuff that you are interested in did find its way in. That's really cool. So was revising this story different for you then, given that it came from this different place?
Um, this is probably going to sound bad, but I did very little revision on this
Hey,
piece.
we get lucky from that, right?
Very little. Most of the revision that came was when I was working with Ron on the proofs of this and talking about some of the images that had felt out of place to him. So in the original draft, I had comparisons of Oil to the Venom symbiote and to No Face from Miyazaki's Spirited Away, who's like this big black cloaked spirit. And for me, those images were connected to this idea of the art coming from outside the country, right? That we're obsessed with the Western images or the Japanese images. Um, but ultimately, we landed on removing those images because they took away from the like timelessness of the piece, or this kind of, I think what you were talking about, like this compositeness of the dictator and this sort of not too directly pinpointed in a certain time or certain moment in history. We have the World War II history that led up to like what's been the long American campaign for oil in the
Mhm.
Middle East. But so ultimately, and I think this happens a lot with my flash that I write, is I do very little revision. They tend to come kind of fully formed, and I think this is because I've put so much work into studying the art of flash. In the years leading up to where I am in my career, I took Robert Olin Butler's class 3 times when I was at Florida State, and he drills us in the art of flash. And I was like so desperate for him to tell me that my work was yearning that I just kept coming back.
That's that's
And in
funny.
doing, I tortured myself, but I also learned a lot about like the rhythms of flash and sort of like this instinct for where to land at the end of a piece. Um,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as I mentioned already, the ending really does. I mean, you stick the landing very well in this story. You speaking of Butler, Ron Mitchell, the editor in chief, worked with Butler when he was at McNeese State. I don't know if Ron mentioned
mm,
this to you or not. So this was before this was, and Ron talks about how um, uh, he Butler won the Pulitzer while he was at McNeese, and then left to go to Florida State. So the yearning stuff comes up in our conversations
oh yeah.
quite a bit. Um, so um, flat. So even though this story came sort of from a different place for you, flash fiction is not new to you, though. I mean, flash fiction is something that you work in consistently.
Yes, yeah, I do. I write quite a bit of flash fiction. I think for me, the genre feels really natural. I think because you can encapsulate um, a moment so neatly, and you have room to enter a voice really hot and urgent, and then get out before you can mess things up too much.
Yeah.
When I write short story or when I work on novels, I do so much revision compared with what I do with Flash. And I think that's in part because I haven't learned which direction a short story should go, and there's so much more plotting that has to happen to make a short story or to make a novel come together. And so I often, when I write short story, end up with what feels like a series of flash pieces linked together with a few sentences, and then I have to work really hard to make it seem like one piece. Yeah, so flash I write quite a bit.
It's interesting. I mean, in a kind of reductive way, I guess, the longer the story, the more chances you have to make a mistake. But
Yeah.
but there's something really intriguing about Flash, just that I think writers can get away with a lot in Flash that we like this story, for example, you know, I don't know how you would make it work at 15 or 20 pages. It would be a very, I mean, of course it could be done, but it would lose, I think it would lose something special that this story does, that this, and I mean, it's probably what, like 500 words, 750 words,
Mhm.
something like that. In a
Yeah.
really small space, it can do something that it wouldn't be able to do in, again, 5,000 words or something. And that's just it seems sometimes counterintuitive and strange, but it's, we see it a lot. I see it a lot in reading, and you probably do too with reading for uh, reading
Third Coast. Yeah.
Third Coast. Thank you. Reading for Third Coast, you probably see that too, where you're. I find myself giving more leniency to the shorter stories than I do the longer ones. The longer the story for me, the tighter it has to be, and it seems strange, but when it's short, I'm willing to kind of give it something, right? I don't know. It's a very strange experience, I think, reading um that, but it's something that feels like I've consistently sort of seen over my years of doing this. Uh
Right. When I read Flash, I tend to think if there's something I don't understand, I'm like, oh, that's my fault. I don't understand it. And I need to read again and dive more deeply. Whereas when I'm reading a longer piece, I'm like, why didn't you explain this? Why didn't you make this clearer? I guess I'm definitely not a poet, but it is similar to poetry in that way where you are reading a lot more in between the sentences, I think, than you tend to do in longer works.
yeah. Well, and for example, in this story, we'd probably want to know who the dictator was.
Mhm.
Probably don't want to know what country it was. We probably want to know when it happened if the story was more than Flash. But in
Mhm.
this Flash space, you can get away with leaving all of that out and focusing just on these sort of strange but beautiful moments,
Mhm.
tense, scary moments too in this
Mhm.
story. So one of the things that I was really drawn to, I mean, I think the writing is tight as it should be in a Flash piece, bringing us back at the end, as I said, to that this sort of sensual nature of the oil. Um, but what I was most drawn to was the scale of this story, right? This story, and this kind of almost seems maybe the opposite of what I've just been talking about, but it feels so big, right? I mean, we're talking about this unnamed dictator in this unnamed country at an unnamed time. And it feels like the scale and the scope of this is huge, but yet it's the brevity of it that makes it work. And I don't really know if there's like what you could even say about that. It's just that there's something really sort of magical that happens in this story. And to me, I think it has something to do with the scale of it.
Mhm.
So, I mean, was that something on your mind? Um, Probably not initially when you were composing it, since it was a
Mhm.
ink blot thing. But as you were getting into the story, was that something you were aware of?
Yeah, I think um something I was really interested in was juxtaposing these moments of intimacy with the public hanging, right? And with this moment of horror and the tension, a lot of the tension in the piece being about the relationship, in spite of these really grand scale things that are happening around our main character. I also think what you're just describing is part of why this worked much better than the attempt I did at making a play about the show trials. And the play I was working on was much more specific. I was trying to have all of these real historical characters. I had the character of Sadek al-Shweidi, which is one of the first students that Gaddafi hanged in a public show trial, and Huda, the hangwoman. And it was juxtaposed with like wrestling, and with sort of like these two Libyan boys watching wrestling, and while their classmates are being forced to attend a hanging and they've skipped school, and like the absurdity of like Hulk Hogan and the Iron Sheik on the TV and that showmanship juxtaposed with the trial. And that, like, I think part of the trap of trying to write that piece was all of the backstory and the details of the truth,
Mhm.
like the literal truth, the nonfiction truth. And sometimes I think I end up being able to get better at the emotional truth just by writing fiction. Right. That's why I'm a fiction writer, right? Is because I think that's how I can access truth and how I can bring forward these really complicated feelings about these very dark realities that many people have lived in. So,
Uh, that sounds like a really cool project. I mean, even if it didn't work out, if maybe it hasn't worked out yet, because that sounds like a really
right,
fun project.
yet.
One other thing about the story too, there's the turn. I mean, I'm going to call it a turn. You mentioned that it's not poetry, but there's this feels like a turn to me in that last paragraph. So there's this very intimate moment between the dictator and the you, right? And they boil the lobster, and it's very sort of sensual. And he feeds her the food, feeds her the lobster with his fingers, and then this transition is like abrupt, but like in the best way, right? After you attend a hanging.
Mm,
And, you know, probably that, and I can't remember exactly, but probably that was the moment in reading this story. I was like, okay, this is special, right? It's doing
mm,
something, that turn um, was, shocking, but in the way that we want it to be. So I just
mm,
really, really like that hard turn it makes there. And as you said, it balances that intimacy with this horrific thing. And then it brings us back to the sort of the sensory and sensual with the oil on the fingers and the
mhm.
flavor in the back of the throat. Yeah, just that was just um, I imagine when you wrote those last lines, it's like, yeah, I nailed that last line. It's cool. It's a cool
It-
feeling when that happens. It doesn't happen much, but it's
yeah.
cool when it does.
Yeah,
At least for me
absolutely.
anyway. I should not project. For me, it doesn't happen much, but when it does, it's a good feeling. Um, so shift gears a little bit. What kind of books or writers did you read early on, or that you find yourself going back to for inspiration?
Yeah, for sure. I grabbed some because I'm like, these three are kind of like my holy trio right now as I'm working a lot in horror writing. So like I think one of the first books that I read that I was like, I I aspire to this was Beloved, like just the deep complexity of language that she has throughout this piece, but it's a haunted house story. And that's exactly what I want to be able to do is to I would consider this, I know it's like one of the best works of literature ever, but I would also consider it a genre book. There's ghosts, come on, they're throwing the furniture around. And then I also grabbed Haunting of Hill House and I grabbed The Shining. And I think all of these books are really similar in that we have a character who is debilitated by their like past actions or by their sort of like addictions, their guilt, who is being tested by the world around them. And so all three of these books I were very foundational for me. And I found myself kind of um, turned away from some of this kind of writing, like that more genre bent. I think there was for quite a while in the creative writing world this push for realism, right? Literary realism. And so in the work that I'm doing right now, I'm really trying to allow myself to back off of realism and just do what I enjoy. Uh, do what I enjoy. This piece, I really didn't know how to categorize it because when I enter the world of this piece, it feels so surreal, even though everything in it is firmly based in reality. And then otherwise, the things I've been reading recently, I just passed my comps this semester, so I have been reading a lot of things I'm required to. But one of my like specialty areas was dystopian fiction written by women. And that was totally fascinating. And I think that connects a lot to what I write about. I write a lot about power dynamics in between men and women. Um, and it was kind of crazy, like reading all of this dystopian fiction by women just to see the themes that come up in dystopia by women that don't come up in men, especially like sexual violence and concern over the like right to a body, right? Right to one's own body. Um, I think there's in dystopian fiction by men, there's a lot more focus on like the control of thought. Whereas in the dystopian fiction by women I've read, there's a lot of focus on control, on like the physicality and on violence against women's bodies.
Yeah, that sounds like a there's probably a good article or paper there for you if you wanted to
Right? If
wanted to
I
go that
wanted
route.
to write articles,
Uh,
but alas.
I don't blame you for not wanting to necessarily, but I think there's definitely something there. I think that's really cool. Um, any other so in your recent reading list, or even beyond that, are there any other writers that people should be reading that maybe we aren't, or anybody who's unsung or anything like that?
I don't know. I feel like everyone should have read this, and I don't know if they have. I think it's Lenny. It might be Lenny Zumas. It's Red Clocks, and this was one of my dystopian books I read this semester, and it was written pre-Trump, but it reads like she like cast some tarot cards and predicted the
Huh.
future. It's very disturbing. But it's brilliantly done. It's an interwoven tale of four women who are coping with Roe v. Wade being overturned, and all of these new challenges that come with that. One of them's like trying to become pregnant by um, I don't know, gynecological means. I'm not sure what the terms are, but I know she can't do IVF because it's illegal because the fetus cannot consent to move from the
Uh,
glass petri dish to her womb, right? So
Uh,
she's struggling to get pregnant, and then we have a teenager who's accidentally pregnant, and we have a woman doing backwoods abortions, and a woman who's trapped with her husband and kids and hates them all. The distance that she goes in this novel, by weaving in and out of these four stories is really wonderful, and it's just really beautifully written. Um, I always talk about also this piece that we published when I was at Southeast Review a long time ago by Maria Adelman, or it might be Edelman. And it's called Elegy, and it's this wonderful reverse chronology piece that I often teach in my creative writing courses about a woman who has had a mastectomy, and it's going backwards in time through her whole history up until before her birth of all of the things that aligned for her to reach this point where she's had her mastectomy. And it's written in the second person, which is one of the point of views that I feel most at home in and is most natural to me. And so I think it's this really deft example of the second person of how to work with chronology in an interesting way and sort of plot as well, being able to plot backwards instead of forwards. And I know she has a collection out that I haven't read. So, so I can't recommend it necessarily, but I love that piece, and anyone who's looking for an example of second person POV in particular, I tell them to look at that because I think it's really remarkable.
I'll check that out because that's a hard one to teach, because often the examples are the ones that have been taught over and over and over again, and
Right.
um, almost to the level that they become cliches. Every creative writing textbook mentions Bright Lights, Big City, right? It's
Oh,
great, but it always mentions that as an example. And this would be really cool because if it's doing that plus something experimental with the plot, that's a bonus.
right.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
I definitely recommend that.
Cool. So what are you working on now, if you don't mind?
Um, so I've finished up revisions on, I hope, finished up revisions on a novel, which is now called Night of Power. Um, and we'll see where that goes. But in the meantime, I'm working on a short story collection called Water, Mud, Ink, Blood, which is so the title story was the runner-up for the Kurt Vonnegut Prize with North American Review last year, and the title story is about um, a Muslim American alcoholic who finds that she can bring her tattoos to life. That's kind
Hmm,
of like the
cool.
vibe of the collection is I found as I was um, starting out as a writer, I would separate my stories in between like Arab and Muslim stories and white stories because I'm a mixed writer. And for some reason, I could not make the like white stories, which all had to do with the supernatural, meld with like the Arab or the mixed identity. And so this has been kind of a recent breakthrough for me that I have found ways to kind of like, I think I had these expectations around what kinds of stories are about Muslims, like, oh, we want to hear stories about like women who are thinking about wearing the hijab, or we want to hear stories about oppression. And so I've kind of been branching off into this collection is all going to be supernatural, fabulous kind of things. And all of the stories will have one of those four elements of water, mud, ink, and blood, which are all kind of like elements of creation, I guess. I guess. And so I'm really enjoying working on that. And it's nice to, after spending years and years working on this novel, it's really nice to be working on something with very distinct chunks that I don't have to keep a whole world in mind all at once. I can have the world of the tattoo creation, and I can have the world of vampires or whatever. So yeah, that's what I'm working on. I'm really enjoying it right now.
So is that collection, are you getting close to wrapping it up as far as where you think it stands, or is just what you're still building it?
I'm still building it. I
Okay,
think I
cool.
have maybe like 6 or 7 stories that are complete or close to complete. And I know there are a few that I have in progress that are not finished. They're still trying to figure out what they want to be. And then I'd like to write a few more pieces from scratch now that I'm out of comps and have time to write more than Flash, which I do love Flash, but I'm looking forward to working on some of those longer pieces now.
Yeah, very cool. Or one of those, is that what you're doing for your dissertation, or is it a different
Yes.
project? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's um yeah, that sounds exciting, and I will keep an eye out for both the novel
Thank you.
and the collection.
Thank you.
Um, you can find Oil in the spring 2025 issue of SIR, and go to usi.edu/SIR to find out how to get a copy. Link will be in the description, as well as Latifa's contacts, website, all that kind of stuff will be there as well. Thank you again, Latifa, for joining us. It was wonderful.
It was wonderful. Thank you. This has been really fun.
All right. Well, we will see everybody on the next one. Thanks.
Right. Bye.